Hello and welcome back. Please take your seats. The next speaker has very extensive experience of governance. It is my great pleasure to introduce Alexander Stubb. He is director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. He has served as Prime Minister, as Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, Trade and Europe Minister of Finland, and also served as a member of the European Parliament. So please, even if he's not in the room, please give him a warm hand.
Thanks a lot for the invite and good afternoon. Sorry I can't be with you there today. I left Copenhagen at 5 o'clock this morning to return over here to Florence, where I hasten to add it's plus 24 degrees and sunny, so we're really suffering. You know how it goes. Really nice to be with you guys, and I've been asked to talk about the new world disorder, power in the 21st century. And I'll do that by giving you an introduction, 3 points, and then a conclusion. So essentially trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. I guess a little bit from an academic background, but also from a practical and political background. So by way of introduction, I think we human beings have a tendency to do 3 things. Number 1, we over-rationalize the past. So we basically draw conclusions from past events and try to juxtapose them today as if they were the same thing. So, you know, we look at peace in World War II, or we look at the Spanish flu and compare it to COVID, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite normal. It's our way of trying to make sense of history. So over-rationalizing the past. Number 2, and this is probably a little bit more dangerous in today's world, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the present. That basically means that at every crack of a branch, we react as if we're looking at the end of the world. Of course, there's a balance between optimists and pessimists where we'll end up. And I'm not trying to deny that there are not horrible things going on in the world. But from a historic perspective, I think you don't have to be Hans Rosling and read Factfulness or Yuval Harari's Homo Sapiens or Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now to understand that we are actually moving in a better direction. Sometimes, 2 steps forward, 1 back, but nevertheless. Yes, there are atrocities, war, the borders of Europe at the moment, we're just out of a pandemic, et cetera, but there is this tendency of really dramatizing things. And I, of course, do not need to say anything. I'm speaking to a partially Swedish audience after the Swedish elections, how dramatic they were. But that's what democracy is all about, Thirdly, when we over-rationalize the past and over-dramatize the present, we actually end up underestimating the future. And I think that's the big problem that we have. I'm not trying to say that, we can always know what happens behind the corner, but it's quite good to try to suss out the megatrends. So my 3 points today then will be, number 1, I will over-rationalize the past. Number 2, I will over-dramatize the present. But number 3, I will not underestimate the future, and then give you a little bit of a conclusion of where I think this new world disorder is actually going. So let's begin with the past and do a tour de table. And let me immediately say that I'm looking at things very much from a Western perspective, and I do apologize already in advance. So if you look at the past, say, 80, 90 years, the world, in my mind, has gone through 3 phases. One was a bipolar world. It was ideological, one pole led by the Soviet Union and their allies, voluntary or not. The other one led by the United States, their allies, mostly voluntary. The Soviet system spoke of communism, controlled economy, and authoritarian regimes and collectivity. The American model was about capitalism, liberal democracy, freedom, and free entrepreneurship. It was a real ideological battle of which system would be able to allocate and provide resources to its citizens. Now, we all know, with the wisdom of hindsight, that the winner of this battle was obviously the United States and the West. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that time, many of us, myself included, I had just started studying in the United States, believed in Fukuyama's thesis of an end of history, which basically said that now all 200 nation states of this world will obviously embrace the three pillars of a functional society, which are liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization, and we will live happily ever after. The second phase, which I call it, was unipolar. In other words, it was driven by the undisputed superpower, the United States, sometimes willingly, sometimes less willingly. And if you remember at the time, it was really all about market liberalization, right? Eastern and Central Europe were liberated from the shackles of communism. It was all about market reform and keeping the state, of course, away. Similar language, in the Scandinavian countries and in the rest of Europe. It was about the four freedoms, free movement of goods, services, labor, and money. It was about the euro. It was about competition, single market, etc., etc. This started, I think, to shift. And I can't give you an exact date because it was tried to over-rationalize the past a little bit too much. But, there was 9/11, which made or should have made us understand that not everyone wants to live our way of life. There was the financial crisis and the euro crisis 2008 to 2014, when we realized that financial markets had to be regulated and free flow capitalism didn't necessarily work. There was the asylum crisis when the state started to come back. There was Brexit and Donald Trump when, a tenet of nationalism came back. Trump wanted to build walls. There was new political language. And then, of course, there was COVID, and now there's a war in Ukraine, and there's an energy crisis. So all I'm trying to say is that the world wasn't led by the US anymore. It became multipolar. So there were a whole bunch of different players in the game, from China to Russia to India to Brazil to South Africa to Nigeria to Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And when you move from a bipolar world to unipolar world and to a multipolar world, then you kind of start thinking that, the world is actually quite messy and not very orderly. And that is my first thesis. No matter how much we want to over-rationalize the past, right now, I would argue we live in a world of disorder. I'll come back to this in my conclusion. And here's where I come to my second point, the present, what is going on. I think we actually had a holiday from history for the better part of 33 years, since 1989. I have grown up in that era, believing really that, well, for a better lack of term, all countries in the world would become Nordic welfare states, right? With all of their tenets and with equality, with justice, with freedom, with openness, with transparency and democracy and the rest of it. But, unfortunately, things didn't turn out like that. And again, I come back to the point that I am looking at this from a Western perspective, and once again, apologies. So are we seeing the beginning of history again? Are we going back to a moment that we have seen previously? I think it's actually too early to say. But I would argue that the driver of this change, real and symbolic at the moment, is Putin and Russia. And of course, if you look at what Putin and Russia is doing, he's achieving exactly the opposite of what he wanted to achieve. He wanted to Russify Ukraine, it became European. He wanted to split Europe, never seen it more determined and united before. He wanted to split the transatlantic partnership. The US and Europe are back together, with a new sense of purpose. He wanted to split NATO. NATO is back with a bigger purpose that it had during the Cold War. And of course, the icing of the cake is that Finland and Sweden are going to join NATO. A thought that was impossible even to say out loud, say about a year ago. I should come out of the closet, and some of you might know this. I have been an advocate of at least Finnish NATO membership ever since the 1990s, but I never thought that the reason that we joined NATO would be Putin, because Putin changed public opinion in Finland. When public opinion in Finland changed, the political leadership changed. When the political leadership changed, Swedish public opinion changed. When Swedish public opinion changed, the political leadership changed. And now we are in a new situation that we did not expect. Has this war been, from the beginning, one of these things that everyone condemns Russia? No, it hasn't. A lot of people were happy, including myself, that 141 states in the UN voted against Russia early on, and 35-ish abstained, and then 4 voted in favor. But little did we understand that the 141 were actually scrambled together at the last minute and were soft. Little did we observe that the 35 countries that abstained actually represent over the half of the world's population, including, of course, India and China. Little did we understand that the reaction in Africa was lukewarm, to put it mildly, because a lot of the countries are non-aligned. And I think, understandably, the argument was that, listen, Europe, this is your war. You've been there before. You've caused 2 world wars. It has ramifications on us, including fertilizing prices, energy prices, and food prices. But do not come and lecture us as former imperial powers about territorial integrity and sovereignty. So deal with your mess, but don't expect us to sympathize with what is going on. Now, the situation might change. We have a big week in New York this week with the UN General Assembly and votes on human rights councils and other things. We don't know. And things have changed from the beginning of the war as well. Without over-dramatizing, no one expected Ukraine to be able to defend itself, let alone push back. This is an embarrassment, not only to Russia, but those countries that have been, well, supporting Russia carefully. China. Xi Jinping does not feel comfortable about this situation. It's not about Putin that much winning, but Putin losing. So the countries that are autocracies who've been holding together are not very happy about what is going on in Ukraine at the moment and with Russia. So there is this sort of interesting shift in my mind from the beginning of the war, when you think, whoa, the West is going to be split like a flock of birds, to 6 months into the war, we suddenly notice that, well, Ukraine is pushing back. And you know what? If Putin and Russia had been able to walk into Kiev within 48 hours, as was expected, I think we would be in a big old mess in the West, because our reaction would have been too weak. Instead, our reaction has been one of the strongest that I have ever seen. I'll finish off the over-dramatizing the present by saying, and I say this as a Finn, coming from a country with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, unfortunately, but not our fault, Russia will be fully isolated from the Western community. And that means economically, financially, politically, sports, culture, energy, travel, and so on. So we will have a North Korea, the biggest country in the world, right on our borders. It is a sad state of affairs, but it is a reality that we have to live with in the foreseeable future. I would say a minimum of 5 to 10 years. And of course, you will need regime change before anything can change at all. I am not very hopeful about ending this war anytime soon. And the reason for that is that Putin wanted a big war and a big victory, and he's getting a big war and actually probably a big loss. he cannot afford to lose this case. And I'm afraid he's on the borderline of doing that. Then I come to my third and final point in order to allow then a couple of questions from the moderator and the audience if so desired. Now, my third point is that obviously you can't predict the future, but I think nation states, or let's divide it into local communities, nation states, and the international community are grappling with similar megatrends. There are many of them, but I would raise four. One is demography. That means in Europe an aging and diminishing population, and that means in Asia, Southeast Asia, and especially Africa, a increasing and younger population. This has ramifications in two directions. For us, are we able to provide the goods, the social services that the general public demands from us? Do we have the capacity to carry that or not? And of course, in a continent like Africa, does it have the infrastructure of education and healthcare, etc., to support an increasing population? Two, climate. We all know what that means. The only thing we don't know is how dramatic it can potentially become. I'm not going to give you a off-the-cuff estimate of what's going to happen as a consequence of the war and us cutting off from fossil fuels in Russia. But obviously it could potentially in the long run disrupt us enough to accelerate the green transition. But in the meanwhile, we have to be realistic. It is going to require this winter and in the short foreseeable future more use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, etc. But that will have huge ramifications globally if we don't solve the climate crisis. Three, the economy. Which countries are able to grow, not only GDP per capita, but otherwise, in order to provide for the goods and services that the country or the area needs? And four, in terms of megatrends, tech and technology. Who is able to provide the best technological solutions to climate change, to economic growth, to demographic problems, etc., etc. And this will obviously shift a little bit. But you see, the common problem that we have here is that societies have a high demand on themselves. I used to be in politics, and it's kind of mission impossible. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. In the sense that the expectations that you have on what society should give you are simply too high from what society can actually provide you. And when that is the case, in its most radical form, whether you are in a autocracy or in a democracy, it doesn't really matter, you start looking for security somewhere else. And in a democracy, that security has now been sought in different types of identity movements, sometimes extreme movements. And I'm not even identifying whether you're extreme left or extreme right or whatever. It is just this notion of identity. So if the state, say Sweden, cannot help you, you start looking for something else in a community. And in the world of ample information, obviously, things can go horribly wrong. And the paradox is that the things that were supposed to bring us together, like this Zoom meeting, technology, information, trade, value chains, energy, etc., they are actually potentially driving us apart at the moment, creating these types of new identities in the midst of asylum crisis or Euro crisis or Brexit or Trump or COVID or even the war in Ukraine. And the interesting thing is, and here's where I come to the instruments of power. Geopolitics is not only about military anymore and guns and tanks. The instruments of power that can be used in today's world, like energy or sanctions or information or technology or whatever you want to use, they have actually led us to a world where the line between war and peace has been blurred. So some people, including Mark Leonard, has said, I think quite wisely, that we potentially live in an age of unpeace where everything can be weaponized. Now, I am not predicting that the future is only about weaponizing everything, but what I am predicting is that it's going to be increasingly difficult for societies and governments to provide the goods that are expected of them to provide, and that could potentially lead to unrest. Here's where I then come to my conclusion in the allotted 20 minutes. I think we need to look at three possible scenarios here. Obviously, they're countless and much more sophisticated, but nothing that can be put into 20 minutes. One is a scenario where we go back to things national, where we basically say that, well, this globalization didn't work and it's better to protect our own. So let's procure all of our own vaccines, let's bring the market home, let's produce everything that we have at home, and, you know, Sweden is the thing, or Finland is the thing, and et cetera, et cetera. Second scenario is regional. So what we'll start to see instead of deglobalization is the regionalization of globalization. So Europe comes together, North America comes together, perhaps Latin America comes together, Africa, Asia, Eurasia, etc. So the regionalization of globalization, trying to find a comfort zone there. And the third one is the internationalization of the system. But the problem here is that the multilateral system that we have, the UN, the World Bank, the WTO, etc., they were created in the aftermath of World War II, in the image of the winners of World War II, and certainly in the image of the West. And this won't fly with China. It won't fly with India. It won't fly with many other players who are basically sick and tired of having a rules-based system based on the rules of us. And here we come to the big question. What are we going to have in the world? Is it going to be principled foreign policy, or is it going to be practical foreign policy? And I actually think that in the future, it's going to have to be a combination to succeed. I predict, and this is my conclusion in this new world of disorder and power in the 21st century, that we will not have one player or two players or three players dominating this world. The world will be less orderly than what it used to be, and there'll be more players in the game. And I'll just leave you with the thought of the different players, transnational players. Who do you think is more powerful in today's world, Facebook or Finland? You decide. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alexander Stubb. That was fascinating. What a trip you took us on. Before I hand over to the audience here, I'm actually going to ask sort of not a private, but a little bit of a personal question. This context is heavy, but that the country or the state of the world right now. What keeps you going? I mean, you work with these difficult questions every day. How do you get up, and what sort of? Because I think people here are in need of some sort of energy boost or some sort of feeling of purpose here, because it's a difficult territory that we're navigating in, just like you laid out here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess two answers. One is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and one is a little bit more serious. I mean, it's a hell of a lot nicer to analyze the world as an academic and as a professor. Not only the sense of freedom, but sort of the oxygen that your brain gets from, you know, reading, observing, giving talks like this, and analyzing. When you're in politics and when you actually have responsibility, you feel exacerbated. So, you know, you have governments which are constantly under attack, and I don't care from, you know, which political side they are. It's really difficult to govern. I mean, super difficult to govern. So I wake up in the morning and I feel like, yeah, you know, now I can read and I can analyze and this is kind of fun. So I must say that freedom is better than responsibility. So that's my first answer. My second answer is this sort of innate optimism that things have a tendency to turn out well. So if you don't know what's going to happen, assume that something good will happen. Yeah, there'll be sort of spats of bad in the way, and I look with horrification at war in Syria or war in Ukraine and mass graves, and I don't understand why the hell all of this is going on. But at the end of the day, if you look at it from a historic perspective, and if you really simplify in the sort of Hans Rosling, Yuval Harari spirit that I mentioned earlier, we die less of disease today. We die less of violence today. We certainly die less of malnutrition. So the world is becoming a better place and a fairer place. It's just not happening all at once. And what does keep me optimistic, I'll finish off with this, is a certain understanding that we do not live in a utopia. The world is never going to be perfect, but we certainly don't live in a dystopia. So just understanding that we live in an imperfect world that keeps on improving, keeps me ticking and keeps me going in life. And you should be optimistic in that room as well. I mean, don't be one of these that, life sucks and it's all going to hell. No, I mean, it doesn't. It does get better at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions in this room. I know you are being followed by different audiences in different spaces here at the university. But those of you present here, hand up if you want to ask a question to Professor Stubb. Don't be shy.
Got a Finnish audience, huh?
They're contemplating your wisdom here. That's what they're doing.
Right.
All right. So I have another one for you before we sign off here. We have a lot of students here, obviously. We are at the university. What advice can you give in terms of good sources of information? You mentioned Finland, Facebook, maybe not Facebook, but let's look at other sources. Good. What newspapers should they be reading? What other sources? You mentioned, of course, Lustig and Harari in the beginning. If you want to deep dive into these topics, where do you dig?
Sure. I mean, the first, of course, I have to do a commercial break. I think each one of you should apply for the School of Transnational Governance here at the European University Institute, an absolutely fantastic 2-year master program where you dive into all of these issues that I was just talking about. Jokes aside, I don't want to make an ideological statement, but, I can give you my sort of reading pattern. I mean, I read a lot. I do speak a few languages, but I find myself reading mostly Anglo-Saxon media. So for me, the Financial Times is a sine qua non. The Economist is very close to my heart. New York Times is very close to my heart as well when it comes to the sort of big picture. I'm very avid on Twitter. I do admit that. Sometimes a little bit, OTT on it as well. But there you end up getting a lot of good sources, but you just have to learn how to siphon, fact from fiction. Then on the book side, I'm not going to start, giving you, a tour de table of what I think you should read. But what I do say to everyone is, I try to live a life of 1 + 1 + 1, which is every day there's 1 hour of reading a book, 1 hour of exercise, and then only 1 hour of social media. You can guess the one that I fail on mostly, but the 2 first ones I can guarantee I stick to, because the brain needs that training. It needs it a lot because we live in a world where we're just constantly on the phones, and the dopamine that's injected in the brain of getting a quick piece of information, it doesn't stick there for that long. And my final point to any university student, old or young, is that please keep your mind open and curious. Do not reject off the top of your head just because someone is of a different opinion. It's this sort of clash of ideas which should be more of a conversation than a battle that I think is important. So have a little bit more tolerance before you put 280 characters down on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for giving us this speech here today. Thank you very much, Alexander.